Hello! Today I'm lucky enough to be tasting a wine that actually hasn't been released yet. This is the 2023 vintage of Tenuta San Guido Sassicaia, so a super Tuscan wine from Bolgheri, made predominantly from Cabernet Sauvignon. Now, although it hasn't been released yet, the 2023 Sassicaia created quite a stir when it was released to the press early last month in February. And reactions were very enthusiastic. Evidently, Monica Larner, who was tasting for robertparker.com, compared this wine enthusiastically to the estate's legendary 1985 vintage, which was the first Italian wine to which Robert Parker gave 100 points. So this assessment of Sassicaia would leave this as one of only two vintages of Sassicaia that have scored 100 points, leaving me to ask, is this really a 100-point wine? And is this the best Sassicaia that has perhaps been made so far? Just to give you a background to the estate, Tenuta San Guido, it's a 2,500 hectare estate near the village of Bolgheri in the Maremma, running from the Tuscan coast up to the hills. And the estate's history dates back to the Middle Ages. In fact, it was in the hands of the della Gherardesca family for over 1,200 years, and it's named after one of their ancestors, San Guido della Gherardesca. But at the same time as having this incredibly long history, in recent history, Tenuta San Guido has actually been seen as quite a forward-thinking estate, being committed to issues such as biodiversity long before they were fashionable. So as well as creating Sassicaia, the pioneering super Tuscan wine, Tenuta San Guido is also the home to a very successful racing stable. They have some amazing olive groves, possessing over 10,000 olive trees that are more than a century old, from which they make some fantastic olive oil. Forestry is carried out on the estate. There's a significant wildlife refuge in an area of traditional wetland down by the coast. And there's a significant amount of mixed agriculture, both growing crops and raising cattle. Now, the Marchese Mario Incisa della Rocchetta was one of these forward-thinking owners of the estate, and he took over Tenuta San Guido when it was given to him and his wife Clarice when they married in 1930. His experiments with winemaking were one of these forward-thinking ideas, and although it took a little while for his ideas about the wines to be accepted and for the wine to be successful, eventually these wines led to a transformation of the region to an area producing high-quality wines, and didn't actually commercialise any of these wines until he released the 1968 vintage in 1971. However, I think you can gauge his success here in the fact that by 1994, Bolgheri had its own DO. The wines that he had initially released had been released as vino da tavola, just simple table wines, because there was no DO for quality wine here. By 2013, the estate had its own DOC for Bolgheri Sassicaia. It was Mario who first realised that in many ways the soils here were very similar to those of the Grave in Bordeaux. These are actually quite complex soils with calcareous zones that are rich in something called galestro, which is a crumbly sort of clay schist, as well as stones and pebbles, or perhaps you might say gravel, from which the wine Sassicaia, meaning field of stones, takes its name. Vineyards are located at altitude starting at about 100 metres above sea level, heading up to the oldest vineyards, which are at about 400 metres above sea level, with most of them having a west-southwest exposure. The 2023 vintage was largely marked by a balanced climate, with frequent rainfall falling in the spring and the early summer, something that ensured that the soil's water reserves were well filled up. The preceding autumn had recorded temperatures above average, and there was quite a mild winter. Bud break occurred regularly around March the 20th, and persistent rain during flowering and fruit set gave a slight decrease in yield. What that did was it ended up giving well-shaped bunches with relatively lower berry densities. And summer brought no particularly unusual conditions. There weren't any strong heat spikes. High temperatures in July, for instance, were mitigated by the soil's good water reserves and by breezy conditions. August, on the other hand, alternated between quite warm phases and phases that were more humid and cooler, being dominated by weather conditions that had come in as a front from the Atlantic. And that August rainfall had the effect of slowing technical maturation, so slowing down sugar ripeness and helping the retention of acidity, while at the same time tannins continued ripening. Harvest began on September the 4th and concluded on the 5th of October. There was very little pressure in terms of having to gather the harvest quickly because of any rainfall events or anything like that. And as a result, the team were able to wait until each plot and variety had reached their optimum ripeness before harvest commenced. Everything was picked by hand, of course, and the first plots picked were those at lower altitudes in slightly warmer vineyards. Those tended to be younger vines, and the last ones that were harvested were the older vines, which tended to be on the higher altitude vineyards. Yields per hectare for the old vineyards were about 30 to 35 quintals, so I believe that's about 3 to 3.5 tonnes per hectare, and the yields in the younger vineyards tended to be almost double that. And so the grapes arrived at the vineyard. They were healthy, they were intact. They had lovely perfumes, they had good acidity, and yet at the same time they had some really nice ripe tannins. Some absolutely meticulous grape selection went on arrival, and then the fruit was destemmed and went into stainless steel tanks for fermentation. Fermentation temperatures were carefully controlled, and those stayed between 28 and 29 degrees C. So relatively extractive temperatures, but without getting too high and either shocking the yeast or extracting harsh tannins at warmer temperatures. Fermentation was instigated using a yeast culture that had previously been selected from the vineyard. So this is the use of autochthonous yeasts. So this is a yeast that has come from the terroir, but not one that's been allowed to start the fermentation spontaneously. Rather, a particular yeast strain that has been selected and cultured by the winemaker and introduced to the vats at the beginning of fermentation. Maceration involved frequent pump overs, with an idea that this introduced aeration, reduced CO2, and helped to support the yeast's development. Malolactic conversion was allowed to occur spontaneously with the naturally present bacteria. Once malolactic conversion was complete, the wine was racked until clear and put into 225 litre French oak barriques. Of these, 40% were new, 40% more had been used for one previous year, and the remaining 20% had been used for 2 years previously. The wine aged in barrel for 24 months, during which period blending went on. The blend for the 2024 Sassicaia is 87% Cabernet Sauvignon with 13% of Cabernet Franc. Once the wine is bottled, it's then allowed to rest in bottle for between 3 to 6 months prior to release, and my understanding is that this wine will be released to international markets in June of this year. So let's take a look at the wine, shall we? First thing I will say is that this wine is significantly deeper and darker than either of the Tenuta San Guido wines I've looked at so far, the Le Difese or the Guidalberto. However, it's still not opaque. The wine has a nice vibrancy, but it's not the sort of the vivid cherry red that the other two displayed. It is more sort of concentrated and ruby coloured. Swirling it, however, it's producing some quite impressive legs on the side of the glass there. This is clearly a wine that has a good tannic concentration. It also has 14% alcohol according to its label. So let's see what we make of the aromas, shall we? The aromas are concentrated and very complex. I mean, this is multifaceted. To start with the fruit aromas, there is a bright red fruit. There's a juicy raspberry note there, sort of lovely juiciness with spicy touches. Again, there's a lively mulberry note. Other red fruits there, you've got cranberries, you've got red currants. And over the top of that red fruit, there are some really lovely lifted top notes. There's quite a vivid note of bergamot and a delicious hint of blood orange. Coming after that, there are also some lovely savoury umami notes, and they really are just hints. It's that umami, that touch of mushroom, that touch of soy. These aren't dominating as you'd get in a wine that is mellow and old, but they are just in there. Also to be noted are some incredibly well integrated sweet spices. There's a cedary note that's beautifully used with some red plum fruit. But coming back to it, it is those lifted high notes of bergamot and blood orange just atop those lively red fruits that are the leading elements of the nose. So let's have a taste. The wine is structured, lively, and has some lovely fresh perfumes. There really is an interplay between some very fine tannins, fresh acidity, and lovely red fruit. The palate starts off again with those juicy fruits. It's cranberries, it's red currant, it's mulberry, and then following on that touch of blood orange. All these lovely, lively, juicy fruit notes are being lifted by this good acidity and supported by some slightly almost gingery, nutmeg, sweet spice notes that are beautifully integrated with the fruit. The wine is relatively full-bodied, but its alcohol at 14% doesn't seem particularly high because it's balanced by the fruit, and the fruit is being lifted by that acidity to give good length. The alcohol's not able to cut off the finish early or anything like that. So this really is a wine with lovely precision and balance. Those lively flavours are lasting incredibly well. And while this is a wine with plenty of structured tannins, those tannins have a suppleness, and the ripeness of the fruit is such that hints of coffeeish bitterness are allowed to contribute to the mouth-watering sensations, and they're supporting this lovely long finish, but they're not able to overpower or dominate the lively fruit. So perhaps the question I need to answer is this a wine that's worth 100 points? I think my answer is that I'm finding very little to fault in it, although I have so far been slightly cautious and given it a score of 99 out of 100. I think maybe one of the things that's holding me back from going to 100 points on this is the fact that it doesn't display the same density and structure that is still amazingly evident in Sassicaia's 1985 vintage, which really is a monumental wine. That having been said, I think the two wines have been aiming at contrasting styles, because I think the current winemaking at Sassicaia is much more about poise, balance and elegance, and much less about power and density. Don't get me wrong, this has good density, but on top of that it layers harmony with this beautiful fresh fruit. So perhaps I'm being unfair in suggesting that this is a wine that isn't worth 100 points simply because it's not achieving something it never aimed to do. I think therefore also, if you're wanting to know, is this the best Sassicaia that's been made to date? I think you have to ask yourself what you're looking for from Sassicaia. If you're looking for a wine that has power and structure, the 1985 is ahead of this. But if you're looking for a wine that has harmony, elegance and enduring beauty, I think this wine takes it. I certainly don't think there will be a problem coming back to this wine in 30 or 40 years and finding it's still beautifully harmonious, elegant and fabulous. And so I will watch its development as closely as I can, and I could well believe that in the future I could become convinced that this is a wine worth 100 points. So thank you so much for watching this video. I do hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, I'd be very grateful if you'd press the like button. That would be fantastic. If you're watching these videos and you enjoy them and you haven't yet, perhaps I could ask you if you could subscribe. I'd be very grateful for your assistance with that. Having more support would help me to build the channel further and faster. To that end, if you have any friends you think might like to watch the video, please feel free to pass it on to them. I'd really appreciate your support in that way. If you have any comments or questions, please pop those in the comments box below. I'd love to know what you think about the wines I'm looking at, the tastings I'm doing, or anything else that relates to that. I will of course leave a link in the comments box to the WineSearcher webpage for this vintage of this wine, so you can see at what price it's being offered and when it becomes available. I'm sure you'll find that the prices it's being offered at aren't cheap, but given the fact that this looks likely to be one of the most exciting vintages of Sassicaia yet made, I think that's to be expected. So thank you once again for joining me in this tasting, and I do hope that maybe you'll manage to find some time and come and join me for another tasting in the very near future. Till then, bye for now.